Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't see anybody else on the outside, but we're going to get started as per time. There's been a slight change in the order, and I'll leave to the gentleman on my left, on your right, to sort themselves out and also briefly introduce themselves so we know what's going on. Please. And it's 20 minutes, at which point we'll take the rest of the time for questions.
My name is Hayrettin Yucesoy, and I work at St. Louis University. My specialty is Abbasid history, so I am here to represent the Golden Age. One of the Golden Ages, anyway. I don't have time to read this, but this is for you to read because I base my talk on this text. So, feel free to, if you are bored from my talk, then you can actually entertain yourself with this one, which is an extraordinarily important text by Ibn Taymiyyah. And I'm going to be talking about Islamic political thought and the issues of decline and Golden Age. If you check George Sabine's History of Political Theory and the Cambridge History of Political Thought, you will see nothing about Islamic political thought, and I use Islamic political thought actually in quotation marks. Except a brief treatment of it at the end of the volume dealing with the 20th century in general, under the chapter titled Beyond Western Political Thought. This is one big problem that we have to deal with. But there is another problem related to this, which is the way in which the specialists and the generalists have been dealing with Islamic political thought, which I would like to examine in this presentation. The received wisdom goes that Islamic political thought was divided into three distinct epistemic categories, only one of which is considered properly Islamic. One is political philosophy. It was advanced by philosophers who offered an exposition of politics under the subject of practical philosophy, which is mostly thought to be theoretical, short-lived. For example, the last greatest representative of this tradition is considered to be Al-Farabi, who died in 950, and quite marginal. Another one is the siyasa, which is secular governance, was elaborated by belles-lettres and secretaries, and included manuals of statecraft, the genres of Mirror for Princes, and ethics. The received wisdom dismisses these two traditions as either marginal and unauthentic. The third one is the juristic or legal politics, which is dealt with in medieval Islamic history under the umbrella of the imama, which was mostly elaborated by jurists and theologians to promote the ideal religious form of government, is seen as the only properly Islamic political thought. The problem with this juristic theory, however, according to this view, is twofold. A, having allied themselves with the caliphate and noticed the growing gap between their ideals and the reality, theologians and jurists gradually made concessions from their ideals until political thought was reduced to a bad copy of the reality. As the caliphate declined, political thought followed suit after the 10th century until it was confronted by Western modernity to alter its fate. In short, political thought paralleled the rise and decline of Islam itself. B, Islamic political thought consciously and continuously rejects rationality. It does not recognize reason as a foundation of political morality, but rather a branch of religious law which determines how political authority should be dispensed. As a result, according to this notion, Islamic political culture, and to a large extent practice, lacks the notion of separation between religious authority and temporal power. The task before us is therefore dismantling this notion piece by piece to let new narratives emerge. Let me direct your attention to the handout containing a passage from Ibn Taymiyyah. The quotation is taken from his treatise on public morality, Al-Hisbah, and treats the question of what we might call justification of state authority. Why do we need a state? or government. With the standards of the conventional wisdom, Ibn Taymiyyah is considered a scholar of the period of decline, one of the inspirational sources of modern Salafi movement, and one whose thought represents in modern Islamist and Orientalist discourses an attempt to bypass history, i.e. the decline period, in order to revive the thought and practice of the Golden Age. However, even in this brief passage that you are supposed to read, Ibn Taymiyyah's assumption, reasoning, and argument do not seem to fit the decline narrative. It is out of pace with the paradigmatic Sunni political epistemology about rationality, and it does not propose a break with either its present or history. In the following, I'd like to provide a footnote to Ibn Taymiyyah's text to illustrate how little sense the paradigm of Golden Age and decline makes in understanding so-called Islamic political thought. Let me start with a theoretical point. If we use Bakhtin's lenses here, the text in question seems to refract quite creatively the meaning of previous works of jurisprudence, theology, exegesis, philosophy, prophetic hadith, and wisdom literature all at once, which on the one hand it alludes to and grounds itself in, and on the other hand informs, enriches, and redeploys for a new socio-political context as possible ways of thinking about and articulating political thought. Ibn Taymiyyah's text can be read as an interdiscourse operating with and within other discourses to constitute a new type of political discourse appropriate for the post-Mongol world of politics. In order to introduce his own voice, Ibn Taymiyyah accentuates the notion of maslaha, that we can broadly define as the notion of welfare or social utility, precisely because, first, it facilitates new ways to formulate rational arguments to justify rulership on the basis of universal human condition. Secondly, it allows him to embrace various human experiences under a proper theoretical category. And third, it enables him to expand jurisprudential and theological rationality to accommodate new methods and arguments. Ibn Taymiyyah had to negotiate his thought with and within four competing but interrelated discourses which came to bear on political thought and which had complex histories of their own. One, prophetic hadith. Two, jurisprudential notion of consensus, ijma'. Three, principles of welfare, maslaha. And four, the notion of human rationality. I will briefly discuss them one by one. The spread of hadith and its integration into jurisprudential methodology underlined a major epistemological shift in Sunni thinking. Hadith became a textual representation of a remarkably privileged social and religious discourse maintained by hadith transmitters who soon after their rise in the late 8th century were able to establish it as one of the most major foundations of jurisprudential and theological thinking. The articulation of Sunnism and the formation of its fundamental principles were indebted in a major way to hadith scholars, as exemplified in the life of one of the most eminent jurists in Islamic history, Al-Shafi'i, who died in 820. Hadith became the second source in religious law after the Quran. In fact, the prism through which one approached the Quran. The idea that the imamate was a religious necessity, imamate is obviously the religiously sanctioned political leadership, but by and large is also used as generally government or state. The idea that the imamate was a religious necessity derived inspiration and strength from the prestige of traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. A master theologian such as Al-Ash'ari, 936, with newfound Sunni and Hadith pre-commitments, newfound because he was a Mu'tazilite, then had a change of heart. newfound Sunni and Hadith pre-commitments use Quranic verses, but especially Hadith reports, to argue for the obligatory nature of the imamate. The Hadith-based argument for the necessity of the imamate became so prominent that it was cited as a major opinion in the 9th century, well beyond Sunni circles. Once Hadith became a discursive practice, defining where one stood in the religious and intellectual spectrum, jurists and theologians had to find a way to tackle the question of the imamate without discarding Hadith. Ibn Taymiyyah's challenge was precisely how he would negotiate Hadith as a discourse without violating his basic religious and intellectual principles or loyalties. One way was to rely on jurisprudential rationality, developed out of the need to deal with the issues of an increasingly complex society. Legal rationality in Islamic jurisprudence, which we call fiqh, represented scholars an occasion to devise strategies that would clarify, limit, reject, or modify Hadith to address new questions. With it, it became possible to remember and revive older or alternative views pushed into the margins because of their anomalies to the Hadith paradigm. Relying on historical memory, jurists developed a major argument on the question of the imamate to engage Hadith. The notion of communal agreement, ijma', or consensus, the idea that if the community agrees on a legal or theological issue, its consensus became a legally binding verdict. First appeared in the text of al-Shafi'i treatise, al-Risala, in which the imamate was presented as an obligation dictated by communal consensus. The idea of ijma' gradually spread in jurisprudential and theological writings until it became a major justification for the necessity of the imamate among the Sunni jurists and theologians in the 10th century. It seems that the ijma' played a dual role as a construct, reined in Hadith-based assertions, floating around without a strict methodological structure, and perhaps more importantly, opened the door to embrace and absorb communities' experience as a source of legitimacy. However, ijma' had its own limitations and had its critics. It was essentially a legal principle and favored jurisprudential solution for political questions, and did not have a wide applicability as it became an abstract concept whose practical value confined to a limited number of cases. Additional constraints on both the Hadith and the ijma' came from an elephant in the room. That is the legacy of the imperial practices and ideologies in the Near East, which found talented supporters since the 7th century and experienced a renaissance in the 9th century onward. Expressed and elaborated in treatises of advice to governors, caliphs, and princes, this genre began largely with translating Sasanian imperial literature into Arabic as exemplified in the writings of Ibn Muqaffa of the 8th century. It gradually incorporated aspects of practical ethics, akhlaq, jurisprudence, and Greek political philosophy, forming an influential political ideology that emirs and sultans of the late Abbasid and post-Mongol periods aspired to emulate. Interested primarily in practical governance and the ways by which royal authority could be maintained, siyasa was a distinct discourse on governance. Therefore, part of the struggle during the 10th century, during and after the 10th century, from the perspective of the jurists, was engaging siyasa without undermining their own basic principles. Here comes the use of the principle of maslaha, welfare, or social utility. Al-Juwayni, who died in 1085, marks a major shift in political thinking with his introduction the notion of maslaha into legal and theological reasoning. In general, maslaha denotes welfare and is used by theologians and jurists after Al-Juwayni to mean general good or public interest. Anything which helps to avert injury and furthers human welfare is considered maslaha. The argument from maslaha about the origins of government is based on the premise that social life and leadership are necessary for human survival and betterment. And as such, rulership is needed merely to protect, arbitrate, administer, and in some, avoid chaos and self-destruction. 5 minutes, okay. Once Al-Juwayni made the principle of welfare his overriding argument, he was able to make another leap to discuss polities other than the imamate. He acknowledges that, that forms of government other than the imamate are also legitimate as long as they assure welfare, maintain social harmony, and prevent chaos. Al-Juwayni's maslaha was a very perceptive intervention as his contemporaries and later generations of scholars engaged his views. Al-Juwayni's student, Al-Ghazali, refined maslaha as a concept and argued more extensively and broadly than his teacher for its use in elaborating on social and political life. Once the notion of welfare became part of the vocabulary, especially in regard to politics other than the imamate, it brought to the fore additional question within its semantic field. Was divine law universal? What was the status of society's customs and traditions without it? What was the role of reason in determining the value of things in the absence of revelation? It is not difficult to guess that such questions brought jurists and theologians face to face intellectually with human nature and human societies at large, and presented them a new opportunity to expand the conceptual toolbox of Sunni epistemology, that is the toolbox used by someone that I do not wish to talk about in this context, Jared Diamond, but it is also used by Terry Burke for his own approach to centuries of Islamic history. But here I think it is useful to use as well the concept, because they had a conceptual toolbox with which they operated. This is where jurists and theologians engaged a crucial subject long in the discussion among philosophers. Why does humankind need coercive authority in the first place? Why should social organization be beneficial to humans? Initially, the subject was raised as a philosophical question among the philosophers, which later made its way into juristic and theological writings and became a major part of the discourse shortly after the emergence of the theory of welfare. As far as I know, the first one to discuss this problem in some depth among the jurists and theologians was Al-Ghazali and his contemporary Raghib al-Isfahani. The argument is that humankind is civil by nature. And for those who understand Arabic, al-insan madaniyun bil-taba', this is something that familiar to us from the history of philosophy and political thought. But this is something new among the jurists and theologians. And that humans have a natural propensity to live in communities and therefore need to cooperate among themselves. From human cooperation results the familiar storyline of the birth of human communities and eventually the rise of cities and so on and so forth. One must admit that this line of thought is very much different from an argument based simply on a tradition attributed to the Prophet asking the faithful to institute rulership or leadership. To turn back to Ibn Taymiyyah's text, we can see how it is creatively linked to a web of discourses that the author is deliberately bringing to the foreground for discussion. The text is in fact a palimpsest, containing layers of both the erased and the erasing, the absorbed and the absorbing, and the transformed and the transforming. It is an intricate transposition, which without its corresponding text, we would not be able to appreciate in depth, and without it, we would not realize the nuances of the other texts. Similar to this, to his earlier colleague, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah thought about the question of reform and revival, and was bold enough to challenge categories, beginning with his own Hanbali background. It is instructive indeed to see a younger contemporary of his, the Ash'arite al-Iji, and still younger scholar, Spanish Maliki scholar al-Shatibi, expand on his ideas. So the relevant question to conclude, to ask, is far from how we come from point A to point B by either decline or progress. On the contrary, the real task for us is how to reconstruct a spider web that the passage of time and we as scholars have disturbed, so that we can reimagine individuals and societies in their complex connectedness. Thank you.
Well, with apologies, back to decline. So, one of the areas the decline paradigm does not problematize is that how the Islamic tradition was inherited and adopted um, by later cultural entities. And in that context, I would like to say a few words in how the Ottomans actually got exposed to the broader Islamic tradition, how they adopted it, and how differently they happen to produce different manifestations of Islam. And I would like to focus on one particular area, which is the language. Because when the Ottomans appeared around late 13th century, we know that they were linguistically different, so they were not fully capable of absorbing the broader Islamic tradition, even though they were exposed. And they were Islamically much less educated than the broader Arab constituency. And they were expanding towards non-Muslim territories. So they had historically had very little exposure to traditional Islamic institutions of learning and traditions. So that led to a very different kind of development in later Islamic period. One of the arguments in conventional decline paradigm is to look for the great figures, the likes of great figures from the 10th century in the Ottoman Empire, such as al-Mawardis or Farabis. We don't see them because the Ottomans had a very different kind of historical experience in their exposition and adaptation of Islam. So I would like to start out with early 16th century passage from a translation regarding one's perception of Arabic tradition and Turkish, from which I will talk about how Turkish became an important medium of how this broader Islamic tradition was conveyed into the Ottoman context. It's by Aksaray in his Imad al-Islam translation. He says, quote, "Do not take this book lightly just because it is in Turkish, for it contains true knowledge and practice. Every people have their own language and people cannot benefit from other languages. Had Prophet Muhammad been here, he would have spoken Turkish because he could address people only in this way. The Quran indicates that messengers were sent to people in their own languages. We know that the Prophet said, learning is a duty for every male and female Muslim. But this does not mean that they have to learn it in Arabic from a teacher, nor it means that the duty is unfulfilled if one does not study it in Arabic. Know that the ultimate objective is to acquire knowledge regardless of the way one may pursue to achieve it. It makes no difference whether one learns it through studying Arabic with an instructor, by hearing from a scholar, or by reading books in Turkish. Although I put on a Turkish garment on this book, its meaning is revealed Arabic. Because God revealed knowledge in Arabic, Arab scholars explained it in Arabic for the benefit of their people. Then, when knowledge passed to Persia, Persian scholars continued to write scholarly works in Arabic. But for the common folks, they wrote in Persian, because common folks could only benefit from it in Persian. When the knowledge passed to the land of Turks, Rumili, the scholars of the Rum continued to write only in Arabic, and knowledge remained as a buried treasure for the common people. Therefore, just as the muftis of our time issue their opinions in Turkish, I revealed this treasure which was buried under Arabic and Persian to the common people." End quote. So in this short passage, we see a number of important anxieties, such as the anxiety of being able to write in Turkish, and the anxiety between the traditional Islamic universalism versus vernacular identity, etc. But one thing I would like to highlight in this passage is the fact that Turkish, by the mid-16th century, became the language of culture in the Ottoman Empire. And we often tend to take this for granted, and which I will argue that cannot be taken for granted. Yesterday in the Three Empires panel, in the other two empires, Turkish did not become the language of culture, although both the Mughal Empire and the Safavid Empire were ruled by Turkish dynasties. And at the time the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Principality was founded, they were Turkic speakers as well. So demographically, perhaps Turkish could have continued to be the language of the folks, but as a language of culture and administration, it didn't have to be the single hegemonic language of the 16th century, and it was the result of a particular historical process, and it was quite a painful process. It was uneven, and it was prompted by specific historical developments, as I will highlight some of them. There are three major turning points as to how Turkish was prompted to become a cultural language. The first was the Battle of Ankara. After that, there was a moment of crisis in which the Ottomans were defeated by the Timurids, and in search for good government, we see a number of important texts in good government were translated in a very short amount of time, mostly from Persian, but also some from Arabic. The competing princes in the civil war, in fact, some of them were given same texts translated by their tutors. So that moment was a turning point in which the Ottomans started to convey the broader Islamic tradition into the Ottoman context for very tangible, specific purposes. But at the time, we know that the Turkish was not still a literary language, and there was no orthography for Turkish, so that created a whole set of difficulties and challenges, both religious and technical. And we see that was manifested by the translators and the users of Turkish. For example, Turkish was a profane language at the time. We see that especially in interlinear Quranic translations, in which even the most basic vocabulary of Islam tended to be translated, such as God, heaven, hell, prayer. So that indicates a vernacular consciousness, but also the fact that the audience were not quite educated in Islam. So Tamu made more sense than Jahannam. They didn't know what Jahannam meant at the time, it indicates. So translating all these basic Islamic concepts into a profane language was quite a feat on the part of the translator. A second challenge was there was no readership for Turkish. When you translate, who would read that? Because the educated already had their education either in Persian or Arabic or both. So if you were literate at the time, by definition, you could read in one of the Arabic or Persian languages. So when you write in Turkish, there was really no readership for that. And also it became a sign of uneducatedness and social status. It was really difficult for one because he could easily be stigmatized as uncultured and ignorant, as we'll see at the time. And there was a whole set of technical difficulties because there was no orthography, and there were a variety of dialects in the frontier society because the folks were moving from different parts of Turkic communities across Caucasia and Central Asia. I'll just give a few examples. Hoca Mesud in early 14th century, for example, says, quote, "I wrote in Turkish because it's more appropriate to speak to people in their own language, and people nowadays all speak Turkish." So there is tangible need the author feels, but then he says, "Turkish does not fit to meter or rhythm. The language of the Turk is such a strange language. When I write in Turkish, I lose half of my weight because of shame. I fear that someone will read it and belittle me for ignorance. Similarly, Şeyhi says, my country is Turk, my language is Turk, ilim Türk, dilim Türk. I wrote Turkish because people from all speak Turkish. Turkish is not easy to read or write. It is not a known language. Turkish lacks suitable expressions. It is cold with no taste. Turkish is dry and rough, just like Turks. If you work on the form, you lose the meaning. If you keep the meaning, you lose the form. And go so on. Many authors highlighted these difficulties and reflected their anxieties of being stigmatized as uncultured. In fact, there is one other case in which the author himself was not as learned, Ahmet Bijan, but his brother was a very established scholar. He tells in his translation that he implored his brother to write a book to educate the folks on Islamic matters for years. His brother refuses to write in Turkish because of the stigma. Ultimately, he agrees to write in Arabic, and then he translates it into Turkish, so relieves his brother from that anxiety and takes the risk himself. So in those early writings, we see a number of reasons to justify the use of Turkish. One is, as we've seen, the prophets address their people in their own languages. So considering themselves as vice regents of prophets and taking up the same mission, they justified it, that they should write in Turkish. They also attributed language an instrumental value, therefore saving Arabic from undermined. So they highlighted the meaning as the most important aspect of using the language rather than itself. And in that regard, many 15th century authors also claimed to have conveyed the same meaning in Turkish, although it may not be taken very seriously by their contemporaries. Gülşehri, for example, he claims that he created a better work than the Persian original. He translated Mantık-ı Tayr of Attar. And so many others claimed that they did the job. And they were mostly motivated by their piety. They took it as an obligation to educate the masses who were mostly illiterate, Turkish-speaking, and less educated in Islamic matters. But more importantly, in this period, we see a demand from the uneducated rulers themselves, who happen to, or increasingly commissioned the translations of books, not only for the broader constituency, but for their own use. So a lot of medical works and political works were used, translated for the use of the court, but some other works also used for other reasons, which I'll talk about briefly. There is one important story which indicates the level of educatedness among these early rulers around the 13th century. It is conveyed by an Ottoman source, but quite telling for the broader Western Anatolia at the time. So, Germiyanoğlu ruler, a principality at the frontier, was enjoying poetry, and he had a number of poets in his court. And one poet, Şeyhi, was a very respected poet, always would present him very elaborate poetry, and he was having difficulty to understand those couplets. In one case, in one gathering, One poet, one unknown poet, took the word and said, "My illustrious Sultan, I wish you well. You eat honey and cream, you walk on grass." And I'll read the Turkish to let you taste the aesthetics. Benim devletli sultanım, akıbetin hayırlı olsun, yediğin bal ile kaymak, yürüdüğün çayır olsun. Now he says that's the kind of poetry I want to hear. It's pure Turkish, it's simple, has no mystical or learned value, but he liked it. He adopted him as court poet. He dismissed the other poet, and reports say that he died out of grief because of the degradation of culture in a week or so. So the rulers became more and more interested in Turkish, but later rulers became or developed an interest in Turkish as a propaganda value as well, because we see that the translators also figured that Turkish works as a medium to reach the folks. In fact, one of the few mediums to reach the folks who cannot read Persian or Arabic. So these Turkish translations were often prefaced with long panegyrics about the ruler, for the Ottoman ruler mostly. So the Ottoman rulers capitalized on this tradition, and they sponsored and commissioned the translation of a number of books. And in that regard, Murat II's period is very important. In his reign of 30 years, he commissioned almost 50 books to be translated into Turkish. All of these are very well-read, popular books in medicine, in poetry, in Islamic sciences. And they were all accompanied by nicely designed panegyrics for the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultan. In later times, with the institutionalization of Ottoman learning, for example, Turkish again became the language of learning, and translation became same as teaching, because the books were kept in their original languages, be it in Persian, in the Sufi convents, or Arabic in Ottoman madrasas. The Ottomans themselves continued to write in Arabic, especially in Islamic sciences, and most Ottoman Sufis, most of them, not all of them, kept writing in Persian, the learned Sufis. However, the instruction of these texts increasingly became Turkish. And especially we see the number of copies with Turkish marginal explanatory notes increased in these periods. So the very teaching activity became Turkish dominated. By the 16th century, we see that in my count, more than 200 titles were translated into Turkish from Arabic and Persian, and translation gained a much broader meaning, such as adaptation. And none of these translations were actually motomot translations. They were all reworkings of original works. And in the 16th century, now Turkish, out of this translation activity, became firmly established. It became a language capable of expressing even the most complicated works of Arabic and Persian tradition, and we don't see anymore an anxiety in writing Turkish. Rather, there was this anti-translationist movement in the 16th century, belittling and criticizing poets and scholars who translate from Arabic and Persian, or use, for example, poetic motifs from Persian in their Turkish poetry. And that created a very different cultural identity in the 16th century. So if I may recap 1 minute, Turkish itself, not Arabic or Persian, became the main vehicle of conveying the broader Islamic tradition into the Ottoman context. In the meantime, Turkish itself became the language of Turkish culture as a result of this particular Ottoman experience in culture and state building. Thank you.
I should say in this panel that I'm not a Turk, but I play one on television. I was listening to the discussion. I thought that no wonder the Ottomans appreciated Nevayi, who justified Nevayi was so popular in the Ottoman Empire since he justified the use of Turkish as a literary language and not simply a simple rough-hewn language. And I was also thinking that the use of the term Turk with a small t is a usage that was used by the founder of the Mughal Empire, by the Ottomans themselves, to refer to these sort of crude people often in the countryside. This is sort of a widespread usage both in Central Asia, India, and also the Ottoman Empire. I'm talking probably preaching to the choir here, talking about the commonalities of these three empires or states, however you want to classify them. Before doing that, I'd like to just say a couple of things, just a couple of cautions about how you talk about these states. And the first has to do with this whole question about multiple identities of individuals. And my favorite example for this sort of thing is when Babur in the Baburnama is talking about his father, Sheikh Mirza, who in a very sort of telling passage, he describes how his father, when he was sitting around with his Turko-Mongol buddies, drinking or doing whatever they were doing, that he would wear a Mongol cap. And then in the same, roughly about in the same passage, he said when his father held court, which wasn't much of a court, no doubt, in the Fergana Valley, but still when his father held court, that he would then put on a turban. And this is what I would say is a subfield of what in Islamic history, a little-known subfield of Islamic history, which is known as turbanology. And that is to say what kind of headgear people are wearing at what kind of time. And this passage simply describes, on one hand, Babur's father's Turko-Mongol identity, which was a sort of social and military identity, and his religious identity. That is to say, when he was at court, he was acting as a Muslim sultan. When he was sitting with his Turko-Mongol colleagues, drinking as they often did, then he was acting as a Turko-Mongol warrior. And these kinds of different sorts of identities that one individual could have in these empires is something worth keeping in mind. People could shift across these identities depending on the context in which they operated. One further illustration of this kind of thing in the political theory sense, to echo some of these discussions of political theory, is this work by the 14th century Indo-Muslim historian, Barani, who was the kind of Indian equivalent of Mustafa Ali, that is somebody who's been thrown out of work and is complaining about the situation. And Barani, in the work, really a political theory work, talks about the problems of the Delhi Sultanate, the Delhi Sultans. He said the problem of the Delhi Sultans is they don't rule like Muslim rulers. Right? That is to say, here you have this massive country, and most of the people are still Hindus, after all. And secondly, he describes a situation where in the streets of Delhi you have Muslim bankers, Muslim merchants, Muslim rulers of one kind or another, sometimes with Hindu bankers, Hindu merchants, Hindu rulers of one kind or another, sometimes with Muslim servants running in front of them to clear out the crowds on the streets of Delhi. And he said, isn't this terrible? I mean, here you have a ruler who's technically a Muslim, but he's not really ruling over a Muslim state. But then in the same treatise, he says, well, how can you rule like this if you're in a country like India? What you have to do is rule like a Persian emperor. And he said, that's the way you have to sort of carry on this kind of rule. And so here you have, again, the sort of different identities of someone who is technically, of course, they're Muslims. You can say that they're Muslim states, in the sense you have Muslim rulers and patronize Muslim institutions. But here you have someone who is decrying the problems about this, but at the same time saying, well, you really can't run a state like this. You certainly can't run a state in India like this. And so you have to run it like an old-fashioned pre-Islamic Persian empire. So here again, you see these kind of different sorts of identities, and the question again, of course, of these Muslim states or Muslim empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, really what do you have going at the upper levels of these societies? Well, I would like to talk about sort of these states as a common civilization or common culture within a larger Islamic Islamic civilization. And what I'm thinking about here is the kind of way that anthropologists talk about cultures and civilizations, and some of you may be familiar with, there's a standard work by the American anthropologists A.L. Kroeber and Clyde Kluckholm called Culture, in which they try to define the essence of civilization, of course, as a distinction in values from one culture or civilization to another. You could probably see this kind of thing most clearly when al-Biruni's work on India, when he enters India and is so shocked by what he sees, and you can see these distinctions in the values of someone coming from a Greco-Islamic, Central Asian Islamic context down into a Hindu South Asian context, and his shock in the culture that he encounters is really palpable. However, having said that, I would say that if you think about these empires, that is the three empires, I would say that usually they're considered separately. That is to say, to take my old friend and unfortunately now deceased colleague John Richards' book on the Mughal Empire, the book on the Mughal Empire hardly discusses anything outside the Mughal Empire at all. And generally speaking, I would say that with our Ottoman Turkish students at Ohio State, that basically when they take graduate courses, they hardly take any courses outside of Ottoman history. And the same thing is true of the students who work on the Safavids. That is to say, there's really extraordinary isolation of these three groups, despite the fact that there's absolutely no justification for it. Right? In fact, the opposite is true. I tend to think of these three empires as being, as I say, sort of a cultural sphere in the same sense that Europe is a common cultural sphere. And that is to say that no doubt there's great differences between these empires in terms of the territories that they conquered, sometimes the religious attitudes, particularly in the Shi'i and Sunni divide. But nonetheless, at least at the level of the dynasty, the military aristocracy, the bureaucracy, and the literati, at least at that level, that you have a common civilization, partially because that in these three civilizations, or pardon me, in these three empires, you do have there really are common legatees, as several people pointed out yesterday, of political, religious, literary, artistic, and philosophical traditions, which are very striking commonalities in all three of these empires or states. And at the same time, as people have also pointed out, you have the circulation of merchants, of poets, of religious vagabonds of one kind or another, of philosophers, of military advisors, constantly going across these borders, despite the fact, and certainly particularly in the case of Iran and India, but also the case, of course, the Ottoman case of military advisors who were the sort of military advisors of their time, who turned up even at Babur's Battle of Panipat in 1526 in India. He has Ottoman military advisors there and the whole way that the military is organized is based upon Ottoman models. So I'm going to say a few things about some of these categories. First of all, of course, all of these states are Turco-Mongol states to one degree or another, right? All of them, right? In the case of the Mughals, of course, you have Turco-Mongols at its very best, a lineage which is impossible not to envy in the case of all three of these empires. That is to say, descended both from Cengiz Khan on his mother's side and Timur on his father's side. In the case of the Safavids, of course, this may be more muted, but still, after all, the Koyunlu, the dynasty whose name students never forget because they always remember the white sheep and the black sheep dynasties in northwestern and western Iran, if they remember nothing else from this period. And of course, in a matrilineal sense, Shah Ismail was a Turk. And of course, he spoke a Turkic language and wrote his poetry, what everyone thinks of it as poetry, but nonetheless in religious terms, very interesting. He wrote his poetry in what might be regarded as an old-fashioned version of Azadi Turkish, right? While Salim was writing poetry in Persian at the same time, one might add. And of course, in the Ottoman case, as we just heard, talking about the Turkic language, the Ottomans obviously speaking a variant of Oghuz Turkish, which eventually becomes the not only the spoken language, but also the written language of the Ottoman Empire. And I've also read some of these poets who were complaining about complaining about borrowings from the Persian and how the Ottomans ought to get their literary act together and stop this sort of thing. So in terms of the heritage, the political military heritage, there are Turco-Mongol states, and the sense of their Turkey origins, of course, is particularly strong in the Mughal and the Ottoman case. Right? The Mughals are still sending money back to Samarkand until they fall apart in the early part of the 18th century. Of course, the Ottomans at various times in their history become more concerned with their Oghuz ancestors or presumptive ancestors in Central Asia. It's interesting, there's much less of this, of course, in the Safavid case, where the religious identity becomes more important than the racial identity many times in their heritage. But in terms of talking about the language, it's also interesting, as a colleague was saying, of course, you have all of these, the Mughals speaking a Turkic language. Babur writes his memoirs in Chagatai Turkish. The Safavids, of course, Shah Ismail writes his poetry in Azeri Turkish. You have Turkish used in the Ottoman Empire. But of course, in the case of the Mughals, by the 17th century, Turkish has pretty much evaporated as a written language, although it's still spoken by some members of the dynasty. And Jahangir, when he goes to Kabul, it was in the early 17th century, he specifically congratulates himself for being able to read Babur's memoirs when he's sitting in Kabul, sort of revisiting the homeland of his ancestors. In the Safavid case, it's interesting because, of course, you have Turkish spoken at the court of Shah Abbas and even at the court of the Qajars in the 19th century. That sort of Turkish identity continues. And to some extent, of course, there's a subculture of Azeri Turkish which continues right on down to the present day. But it's only really in the Ottoman Empire where Turkish becomes the dominant literary and cultural language of the empire. The other striking thing, of course, about all this background is the shared political inheritance, that is to say, the problems of succession. That is the idea of shared sovereignty, which is a characteristic, of course, of tribes in general, but particularly of Turco-Mongol tribes in Central Asia. So in all of these dynasties, you have the same problems of succession, that is, who succeeds the throne. Often there's a kind of preference given to the eldest son, but that doesn't guarantee that the eldest son is going to inherit the throne. And of course, in the Ottoman case and in the Safavid case, this problem is, quote, solved, if you can think of it in those terms, by eventual immersion of the successors in the harem. And of course, I don't know if you can exactly call this a solution from the point of view of the heirs, but it's a solution from the point of view of the rulers of the dynasty. This famous scene of all these coffins coming out of the Topkapı Palace is something that always sticks in one's mind when talking about this. In the Mughal case, of course, this has never changed. Right? That is, there's never a serious attempt to change the system which leads to a civil war at the death or the illness of each ruler. And this Turco-Mongol inheritance pattern continues right on down to the end of the dynasty. Some people sort of look upon this and say, well, you can see this as a great advantage to the dynasty because the most capable military person comes out on top. Maybe that was true in a couple of these cases, probably wasn't true in the 18th century, but nonetheless, in all of these cases there you have that same political inheritance. Also, I think in all three of these dynasties you have the reverence for the Timurids of Herat. That is, all three of these dynasties look back to Herat as the kind of ideal sort of Turkic literary and artistic culture. Mustafa Ali, of course, in his history talks about this. The Safavids themselves tried to sort of generate a phony connection with Timur. And of course, Babur and his descendants look upon Herat as the high point of Timurid culture before, of course, the Timurid Renaissance in South Asia. In the case of the Ottomans and the Safavids, of course, you have what I would consider as lineage envy. That is to say, the attempt to sort of formulate a lineage which will give them the same kind of descent advantages that the Mughals had back to Timur and to Genghis Khan into Central Asia. Certainly in terms of the political inheritance, I would say, also alluding to a comment that was made by one of my colleagues here, that The inheritance from, of course, the Sasanian inheritance of these ideas of the just sultan and the political tradition of the Sasanians is present in all of these courts and all of these dynasties to one degree or another. 5 minutes, really. Well, let me go on quickly and say the two or three other comments in the five minutes I have. Secondly, of course, the most obvious continuities or similarities, linkages in these empires are the literary, of course, the literary and philosophical ones. The literary ones, which have been alluded to several times during the past few days, which are extraordinarily strong. That is to say, it's Persian literature which dominates, which becomes the model for the literary traditions in both Mughal India and in the Ottoman Empire. Even after the Ottomans have shifted over to writing their poetry in Turkish, much of this poetry is, as many of you know, and I've read some of it myself, a string of Persian vocabulary ending with a Turkic verb at the end. And even after Turkish becomes more important, the dominance of Persian literary models is really very, very striking. Secondly, in terms of, I would say one of the points that was brought up yesterday by Rajiv Khanna about Sabki Hindi, and all of these states too, there is this change there is this evolution of the literary tradition, which he very effectively pointed out. Although I would say that this is something which has been discussed going all the way back in the early 20th century. Ghani, an Indo-Muslim literary historian, talked about this in the 1920s. I waded through an entire Persian text on Sabki Hindi, much to my regret one time. And in some Ottoman literary sources, this is also referred to. The sense of these literary changes, first of all, of the common literary inheritance and of the common literary changes is something that you can see in all three of these empires. Thirdly, of course, in terms of the artistic traditions, right? The tradition of miniature painting is primarily a tradition which comes out of Iran and goes to India, or maybe it comes out of Timurid Iranian culture in the Timurid state, goes to India, goes to the Ottoman Empire. No doubt there are changes in the subjects and the techniques as you go into India and into Central Asia, just as there are changes in certain aspects of the culture in European states who have a common, say, literary inheritance or inheritance from the Romans. But the second part of this, of course, is many of the illustrated manuscripts in India as well as in the Ottoman Empire are based upon Iranian literary models. Right? That is to say that the texts that are chosen to illustrate, not always, of course, there are different traditions in these states also, but the texts that are chosen to illustrate are often literary models. Finally, just one point, and I'd like to just end with something which goes back to the political theory, and that's the common philosophical inheritance of all these states, which is something which I've been increasingly interested in. And that is to say the acceptance of Aristotle as the first teacher, this of course is, and the acceptance of Neoplatonic philosophy, which is so striking in all of these empires, that the influence of all of these states. And of course the philosophical tradition which becomes so important in Isfahan and Shiraz in the 17th century has a tremendous influence in India. It really dominates some of the philosophical developments in India in the 17th century. One other point, and of course, and that's the cross-cutting influence of these various Sufi movements, and particularly the Naqshbandis. I was talking to someone yesterday about Ahmed Sirhindi, the famous Naqshbandi sheikh in India. His teacher was a student or a member of the Khwaja Harad group in Central Asia. He comes down to India, gives instructions in the Naqshbandi tradition. Sirhindi refers to himself as the Mujaddidi. This aspect of Naqshbandi tradition is then transmitted back into the Middle East, into Kurdish areas, and eventually, in the case of the early 20th century, right, is influential and one of the most important Ottoman religious figures in the early 20th century. Can I say just one more thing, and then I'll promise to close, and that is, well, all these commonalities are in mind. One thing that occurred to me as I was listening to the talks yesterday and today also, and that is one quite different thing when we're talking about the rise and decline of empires, and that is the influence of Ibn Khaldun. One thing that's striking to me, as far as I know, is it's only among the Ottoman intellectuals that Ibn Khaldun is considered seriously and discussed at length. And that's, of course, because the Ottomans were afraid that what Ibn Khaldun said about the rise and fall of dynasties was somehow a predictive model for the Ottomans themselves, and they were concerned about this. As far as I know, that influence does not exist in the case of the Safavids or the Mughals, and where you do not have the same tradition of decline literature, certainly at the political level, that you have in the case of the Ottoman Empire. So while emphasizing the similarities in these three empires, I would say this is one major difference when talking about the rise and fall of empires, that is personified by the figure of Ibn Khaldun. And just one final point, I was thinking we were talking about Al-Ghazali, of course, the idea about the society and the social groups. If you read Ibn Khaldun, you can see really the Aristotelian source for that idea that you see in Al-Ghazali. But in any case, I'll end there, and thank you very much.
One of the major subfields of the declinist paradigm is the treatment of non-Muslims in the Muslim societies. I say major, one of the major subfields, but I've not heard anything or any reference to the non-Muslims in the last 2 days, so I started to doubt about my presumptions, but I hope that I will make a case that, it is really an important subject. As we have been talking and discussing the last 2 days, there have been some revisions and some radical shifts in the declinist paradigm on the academic and intellectual levels. This paradigm shift has not necessarily trickling down effect in several subfields or public policy levels. I think that studies on the non-Muslims is one of those subfields, and today I concern myself with this subject. Although I'm going to make some references to the Christians and Hindus in the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Empire, in my talk, the center of gravity will be the Ottoman Jews, since my expertise mostly lies in that field. In my 20 minutes, I have 3 goals in mind. First, I will discuss the issue of decline with a particular reference to the Ottoman Jews. And second, I'll try to tie this discussion to the famous so-called discussion of millet system debate in the Ottoman Empire. And lastly, since today is the second day, then we are perhaps started thinking to kind of transfer this intellectual knowledge to a public knowledge. At the end of my talk, I'll try to also make some comments and make some broader observations and ask some general questions as to how to make this intellectual knowledge a public knowledge. Let me begin exploring my first goal. That is the decline paradigm and its repercussions of it in the Ottoman Jewish context. As we know, the declinist thesis tended to view the 17th and 18th centuries through the binary oppositions of purity and corruption. This model implies that only 2 legal situations were possible for the non-Muslims. Those were the strict enforcement or lax disregard of the restrictions mandated by Islamic law. For a long period, the historiography on the status of the non-Muslims in the Muslim empires was inspired by this dichotomy. According to this model, the non-Muslims, particularly the Jews, Christians, and Hindus, lived in a relatively peace and harmony in the golden ages, and then with the increasing or with the introduction of the orthodoxy and puritanical and enthusiastic tendencies in Islam, they experience exclusion, oppression, and even persecution. Of course, by golden age, I mean, I refer to the times of Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman times, and Abbas the Great in the, of course, Safavid times, and Akbar the Great in the Mughal times. And by the introduction of the orthodoxy, I mean, or I refer to the times of Qadizadelis in the Ottoman empires, and the time of al-Majlisi in the Safavid times, and also the time of Evrangizib in the Mughal times. Examining the Jewish case in the Ottoman Empire is quite instructive as to how to show how this golden age and decline paradigm worked in the modern scholarship. Jews occupied important, if not unique, positions within the Ottoman socio-political and economic order. They were contractors, purveyors, private bankers, political advisors, and physicians for the imperial courts, and also other courts for that matter. They made significant contributions to the Ottoman society in science, technology, culture, and entertainment. And they were, again, one of the greatest and biggest, most important non-Muslim communities in the Ottoman Empire. Influenced by the Ottoman declinist argument or paradigm, Benjamin Braude and Bernard Lewis claim that the conditions of Ottoman Jews started to deteriorate in the 17th century due to the fact that immigration of Iberian Jewry was coming to a halt, economic opportunities within the empire were diminishing, and competition with the Christians were increasing. The declinist approach also assumes that Sabbatean movement had a major destructive impact on the already declining Jewish communities. By the way, Sabbatianism is perhaps one of the largest, if not the largest and most influential Jewish messianic movement. It did happen in the Ottoman Empire, and the repercussions of which was felt not only within the Ottoman territory, but also all of the Jewish communities across the borders, including Europe, Russia, and Eastern communities. So this Sabbatian movement again had a major destructive impact on the already declining Jewish communities, accelerating their decline in two important ways. One, it undermined the Jewish position within the Ottoman system since they lost their credibility in the eyes of the Ottomans. And second, it contributed to an unprecedented reinforcement of rabbinical power, which was said to be an obstacle to possible progressive developments in the coming centuries, including the 19th century. So my study of Ottoman courts and archival records, as well as Jewish and European sources, forced me to revise this assumption. It seems that along with the general Ottoman decline paradigm itself, the decline of the Ottoman Jewry was the subject of misinterpretation and misrepresentation. For example, a longitudinal study of Yucesoy court records, by the way, Yucesoy is one of the largest Jewish community in Istanbul starting from the 17th century onwards. Examining those court records in a longitudinal fashion showed me that there was not a dramatic change in the material and intellectual life of Istanbul Jews in the first and second half of the 17th century and also the early 18th century. It is true that the Jews lost some of their privileged positions to the Greeks and Armenians in the 17th century in comparison to their privileged positions in the 16th century, but the pace and degree of the so-called decline of Ottoman Jews have been greatly exaggerated by Jewish historians who concentrated their works mostly on the developments of Jewish societies or Jewish communities in Europe. Although it may be true that the 18th and 19th centuries were on the whole characterized by economic and spiritual impoverishment, that process was slow and interspersed with periods of stability and even prosperity. During the second quarter of the 17th century, for example, a rabbi from Istanbul, Yeshua Benvenista, still refers to the sultans as the merciful kings and maintains that the tax burden, I quote, is not as heavy as that which we had to suffer suffer under wicked Edom being the Christianity. In 1717, Lady Montagu, an English observer of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps with some exaggeration obviously, describes the role of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire as follows, I quote, "I observed most of the rich tradesmen were Jews. That people are in incredible power in this empire. They have many privileges about the natural Turks themselves and have formed a very considerable commonwealth here. Being judged by their own laws," that refers to autonomy, to which I'm going to turn my attention in a minute, "and have drawn the whole trade of empire into their hands, partly by the firm union among themselves. They are the physicians, the stewards, and the interpreters of all the great men in the empire." Unquote. This is not a single example coming from the literature resource and other reports in the 17th and 18th century, which again shows us that there was not a real or a dramatic decline in the 18th century with regard to the status of the Jews. Let me also give you a brief example from the Christian community. I here rely on a secondary source actually, which examines the status of the Christians in the Greek or Ottomans in the 17th and 18th century. That shows us that there was a significant amount of development, economic and administrative development in Christian communities in Greece. And one of the indications of that economic and political development was that their sophisticated register of communal financial records. By examining those records, Socrates Petmezas from Greece shows us that there was those communities enjoyed high level of autonomy and economic prosperity in the 18th centuries. Of course, I mean, there were like many other examples. There were like many other examples which could buttress this point. There were also some other counterexamples as well. But overall, I would say that we can safely challenge some of the assumptions of the declinist paradigm with regard to the questions of the status of non-Muslims in the empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. Among others, I mean, these issues of development and internal economy actually nicely fit with the so-called millet system model in the Ottoman Empire. That brings me to my second point, where I'm going to review the so-called millet system and try to also propose a new model or new concept by which we could reconceptualize, or at least start to reconceptualize to get a better and broader picture of the status of the non-Muslims within the Ottoman Empire. Millet literally means religion in the Ottoman context. I'm being simplistic here, of course. Following the tradition of previous Islamic practices, the Ottomans considered Jews and Christians as people of the book or people of Zimmah. And the mechanism is simple here. I mean, if you want to keep your religion, you have to pay some extra tax, special tax, which was called as jizya. And in return of paying this special tax, Jews and Christians were allowed to practice their religion, and also their lives and properties were being protected by the state law, which was inspired mostly by, of course, the Islamic law. It was generally believed that following the conquest of Istanbul or Constantinople in 1453, Mehmed II established a separate, parallel and autonomous organization for the Orthodox, Armenian and Jewish subjects. These were supposedly homogeneous, empire-wide structures with well-defined borders and hierarchies controlled by Istanbul by their ecclesiastical leaders, the Greek and Armenian patriarchs and the Jewish chief rabbi. This is so-called millet system, and that was well-organized, well-regulated government of minorities. Writing in the 1950s, Gibb and Bowen, in their book Islamic Society and the West, semicolon, a study of the impact of Western civilization on Muslim cultures in the East, consolidated this image of timeless, unchanged, fixed millet system. Arguing against this point, and writing in the 1980s, Benjamin Braude claimed that it was a myth. The millet system was a myth. It was a post-Tanzimat, namely 19th century phenomenon, and it was superimposed on the previous centuries. Yes, Mehmed II had an ambition to create a centralized system by which he would control the non-Muslim subject, his non-Muslim subjects, but this system declined and did not work in the ensuing centuries. Since the 1980s, the scholarship on the subject oscillated between two ends, namely existence or non-existence of this millet system. Most of the times, historians did either study the Ottoman side of the story or the communal side of the story, and did end up thinking that there was an autonomy or there was not autonomy, or there was a millet system or there was not a millet system. They either studied internal life of the communities or the formal Ottoman structures that linked them to the state. The conviction of communal autonomy has encouraged the study of Jewish and Christian communities as self-contained entities having no interaction or relations with the communities of other confessions. Since this conference is also about, again, reconceptualization or reframing of some of our old concepts and vocabularies, I am going to suggest a new concept for understanding the interconfessional diversity management in the Ottoman Empire. And I propose that semi-autonomous millet system would better explain the phenomenon between the time of Mehmet II up until the Tanzimat or 19th century time period on the Ottoman Empire. I think that there are three essential parts of this so-called millet system. One, internal autonomy of religious communities. Their hierarchically and centrally organized empire-wide structures, and Ottoman recognition of those systems. When we examine the pre-19th century developments in the Ottoman Empire, we clearly see that religious communities did have autonomies in their religious and economic affairs. And it seems that they were also, though not empire-wide, hierarchically organized, by which smaller and medium-sized communities accepted the authority of religious and lay leadership of nearby larger ones, and in return received spiritual and material help from them. Naturally, being the spiritual and communal center, Istanbul or Constantinople was the highest religious authority to heed for the Jewish and Christian communities. Centralized collections of taxes was also another contributing factor to the foundation of congregational and communal unity. Here, since I have only 5 minutes left, I'm going to just give you one example to show how this semi-autonomous, hierarchically organized communal structure was working in the Ottoman Empire. My example is from, again, a Jewish community, and it is from the Safavid movement. The case of Safavid movement, as I alluded already, is again a very instructive example to show the hierarchy and autonomy and also connectedness of those communities in the empire. Throughout the Sabbatian affair, leadership of Istanbul Jewry played an important role in shaping the trajectory of the movement. The chief rabbi of Istanbul, for example, sent letters to other Jewish communities in order to make an inquiry about it or to control the Sabbatian activities in those Jewish communities in Cairo, in Aleppo, in Jerusalem, or in other Balkan communities. Feeling himself probably more responsible before the Ottoman authorities, the same chief rabbi from Istanbul sent a letter to the Sultan thanking him that he ended the Sabbatian affair, or Sabbatian madness rather, and saved the Ottoman Jewry from a big malady. This example, and also several other examples coming from the Jewish and also the Christian communities, shows us that there was a considerable amount of autonomy and a communal leadership headed by Istanbul even before the 19th century. But these autonomies were controlled by the Ottoman authorities through taxation, through approval of their communal leadership, meaning that they elect their leader internally. There's this considerable amount of the freedom or autonomy within the communities, but at the end of the day, that leadership should be approved, not elected, but approved by the Ottoman authorities. And also, Ottomans, by providing alternative courts for the members of other communities, other non-Muslim communities, they again set kind of like they check and balances the autonomy and dependency of those non-Muslim communities. But one thing we have to remember, that the border between the state and the communities were always not like were so fluid that individual agencies could always transcend those borders and then go in between, thanks to the social mobility, of course, the biggest of which was the conversion. But even without the conversion, the members of the community could like move along these borders in and out. This semi-autonomous millet system turned into a millet system, to which we did refer, or the scholarship did refer previously, where the Muslims and non-Muslim subjects became equal citizens before the law. The radical shift, perhaps here, was the abolishment of the jizya, which was again one of the most established and well-entrenched Islamic practices in the previous centuries. And that jizya was replaced by a practice of like buying off the military service on the parts of the non-Muslims. Okay. In short, non-Muslim religious communities were recognized as corporate units with a degree of internal autonomy, regulating personal status and ritual issues and finances according to their religious law and custom, with state support for their communal authorities. Just like two points that I would like to make by way of concluding my talk, and I make some reference to the public policy discussions. The Ottoman Empire held together a remarkable broad mix of people, ethnic groups, and religions in a relatively peaceful and stable coexistence. Still, however, we have to remember that the non-Muslims, or non-Sunnis in the Ottoman case, of course, millets were legally subordinate to Muslims. Still, however, it is very hard to imagine that Ottomans maintained this system with a sheer force or naked power. They needed a legitimacy for that. So how did Ottomans maintain or manage this diversity for long centuries, pre and post 19th century, is one of the biggest questions that are waiting to be tackled by us. I think learning and examining this system, exploring this question, give us hints as scholars, of course, to understand the working mechanisms of this pluralistic, multilinguistic, multi-religious community on the one hand, but also it is it's an instructive example for the practicing Muslims, for example, who would see that Ottoman intellectuals and legal people and also the statesmen did struggle with the contemporary issues like that of nationalism, citizenship without, or authority without, autonomy without territory issues, and they resolve this issue within the parameters of the Islamic and, Islamic legal and political practices. So they may learn something from this Ottoman practice and problem solving, conflict resolution tradition. And I think there's also a lesson for the other policymakers who are trying to create a somewhat harmonious societies in an age when the religion is still paramountly important, and they again need to come up with perhaps some better or refined solutions other than the nation and secular states would suggest. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank the speakers for being so timely for fascinating papers, and if I read my watch correctly, 35 minutes to discuss these papers. So I throw open the floor to questions and comments.
I have a comment on the vernacularization. Of course, I find this extremely interesting. There is, however, a much broader context for this process of language change, not only from Turkish. In the Arab world, there is at about the same time a process towards the use of dialectical language in written form. You can also see the same trend in India, in Southeast Asia, of the vernacularization of language. I've written it out many times, but I mix it, get confused when I say it. So my question is, can you provide a reason for this? Is there a reason why at about the same time, in such a very, very broad territory, there is language change? In the case of Turkey, of Anatolia towards Turkey, in the Arab world, from the classical written to the colloquial written. In India also, written vernacular languages emerge. So is it changing identities? Because language is important. If you change language, it must mean something. So for you, what did it mean? Was it change of identity? Did it have an economic dimension? So I was interested to hear what you have to say. And for the paper on minorities, one way of studying non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire or anywhere else is to study the legal framework of what Islam or what Islamic law recommended, which was sometimes applied and sometimes not, or sometimes in a different degree. But I wonder if there are not also other frameworks within which this can be studied, which will give a much less uniform and a more static image of the relationship of Muslims. So there must have been other structures. Maybe there were, perhaps you know the work of Magdi Girgis on the Copts in Egypt, in which he talks about notables who become extremely powerful in the 18th century, so much so that the church leadership is much less important. So, you know, there are other structures, there are other references than the legal model. Thank you.
So there were two questions. Who'd like to go first? Lamar, is it? That one first, yeah?
Thank you. Very good question. I can think of a broader context for vernicularization around that time in the post, let's say, late Abbasid period, all the way to the Renaissance. And I would associate that with the political disunity. Even the rise of Shu'ubiyya, the use of Persian in the Abbasid period, coincide with the decentralization of the Abbasid Empire. The rise of local courts who did not necessarily fully maintain or inherited the tradition had to capitalize more and more on local means in terms of their administration and legitimacy, especially in the case of the rise of Turkic dynasties within the Abbasid framework and later on as independent states. Most of them were quite uneducated, much less in Arabic and very little in Persian. And in the case of Anatolian principalities that just preceded the Ottoman principality, they were totally uneducated in Persian or Arabic. So they had to use some language in the court. And as a result, we see broader interest in Turkish. But here in this talk, I would like to highlight, maybe I may be misunderstanding this point, it's the reverse vernacularization. The rise of Turkish is not a vernacular development. It's not in the sense that turning to the native language, it is vernacularization. But Ottoman Turkish became a Mandarin language, an imperial language, a literary language of the empire. It accorded one's a status. The whole Ottoman elite from Belgrade to Cairo had to speak and communicate in that language. The court language, for example, interesting, until early 16th century, the Qadis wrote in Arabic, but in early 16th century they started to write in Turkish. So in that regard, Turkish became an imperial language, not just rise of a vernacular language. Thank you.
There are definitely other structures. Actually, some of my conclusions based on those like extraterritorial legal structures. The legal structure is the problem if we are confine ourselves to examining the legal literature only. In fact, I mean there are two main tendencies in scholarship. One is basically concerning itself with only the legal structure, in which you can get a very gloomy pictures with regard to the status of the non-Muslims. So we have to really first look at the practices, state practices, as an alternative model as to how this system and relationship and fluidity did work. And secondly, here I don't want to break the secret of Dr. Nabil Matar, who's going to be talking about one of the internal lives of the non-Muslims in the empire, but I think we have to also very keenly we have to be very keenly aware of the internal life and lives of those communities, not only in major cities but also in provincial countries. Not to mention, of course, the non-Ottoman observers of the non-Muslim communities.
Question here and then over here.
Hello. Okay. My question is also on the legal issue, and what I'm interested in hearing about is the, if you will, the intra-Sunni legal polemics that went on. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was a Hanafi empire.
Absolutely.
And there was tension, of course, with some of the Shafi'is, particularly in Egypt. And so can you tell us a bit, and they didn't have to deal as much with the Malikis in some respects, but can you tell us a bit about the intra-Sunni legal polemics that went on and how Shafi'ism somehow eventually became accepted, but not fully sort of recognized within the juridical establishment? Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That would be, of course, one of the the fruitful ways of comparing the status of the non-Muslims within the Ottoman Empire. Again, it really changed and varied from region to region, for sure, despite the fact that there was this large mechanism by which, again, state controls or checks the working mechanism of the non-Muslims there. But as far as the different interpretations of the different Sunni schools, I have not come across with radical differences in terms of their relation to the non-Muslim communities in different parts of the empire. Especially, they, as far as I understand and I see, they did not make a drastic impact on the state policy or the policy makers with regard to the non-Muslims. But the better way of comparing this issue would be like the other empires, like the Shi'is in the Safavids empire, also, and also Mughal's Sunnis in the Mughal Empire. I mean, there you can see some differences, but I mean, as far as Ottoman different practices are concerned, I have not seen any dramatic difference between those practices.
Yeah, two other comments from the floor. I've got one, and I've got two. Yeah.
Oh, I was just, before, yesterday, Cengiz was asking about the situation of the jizya in the Mughal Empire, which is such a major issue when talking about Mughal historiography. And of course, there's the abolition of jizya under Akbar and the reimposition under Aurangzeb in the 17th century to some degree. The degree to which it's actually applied is hard to say, but of course, major distinction. We were talking about this, and that of course, dealing with jizya in the case of this massive Hindu population where there's no sort of centralized administration or religious hierarchy is a whole different problem than dealing with the jizya in the case of the Orthodox Christians or the Jews in the Ottoman Empire, where you do have such a hierarchy, I think.
Few words on Ottoman Hanifism. It wasn't a very strict school in the Ottoman Empire. First, for the courts, yes, the Qadis were Hanifis, but that's mostly for juridical, administrative standardization and convenience. But one may well argue that Shafi'ism, as a school of thought, may have much broader influence on the Ottoman thought. Such figures as Ghazali and Razi were well read and studied by Ottoman intellectuals and scholars at the time. Ghazali's methodology on law, for example, was one of the principal texts taught in Ottoman madrasas. Al-Iji's book on theology, who was an Ash'ari Shafi, again, was a textbook in Ottoman madrasas. So Ottoman madrasas taught Shafi law, and there were a number of muftis among the ranks of Shafis, but Ottoman Qadis were Hanafi, and that's not necessarily a sectarian preference.
My question is also for Cengiz. I mean, there are obviously big changes that go on in the Ottoman Empire from one century to the next, and changes in the way the empire deals with its subjects, changes in the way the systems of elite formation and reproduction are implemented, all kinds of different changes. So I guess I'm wondering, I mean, it's great to criticize a paradigm, but if you have to sort of start sketching out a different way of making a narrative, rather than just saying it's flexible, there are all kinds of different permutations, but how would you place the narrative of what you're studying within some kind of larger narrative of Ottoman history?
It's actually one of the major issues that I have been struggling with. I mean, first there's a labeling issue, like coming or coining a new term. I mean, I actually, originally I called this one as a proto-millet system, and then I've been discussing this term with Dr. Akarlı, and then he wisely warned me, saying that, look, I mean, you are presuming that there's going to be, the millet system at the end. So, I mean, I really found that very useful criticism, and that's why I did come up with this semi-autonomous system. That's A. And B, yes, that's absolutely true that I'm not saying that, I'm not insisting that, this semi-autonomous flexible system was the same as in the 16th or 17th century. On the contrary, of course, because of this time issue, I did not mention all of these problems with regard to this new term and terminology. In the case of the Jews again, I mean, if I may tie to the Hussein's topic of vernacularization, I mean, there was this definite vernacularization in the 17th and 18th century that one could see, for example, coining of a new new Ottoman Jewish identity, so to speak. To be more precise, most of the Jews did come from the European countries, right? And then when did they come in the 16th century, they were labeled or named after the origin of their cities, like Catalans and Catalonians and Lebanese and Portuguese communities and etc. So when we come to end of the 17th and 18th century, for example, most of those names were dropped out, and then they came down to like one or two major congregations. That shows that, again, there was a certain amount of development and then vernacularization and transformation into something new. So again, we are beginning to understand how this system worked, and then how, and from where to where, without necessarily being trapped by this etiological concept of millet system in the 19th century.
I have two questions, but before that I wanted to also say something about the qadis. I think in the earlier period there were indeed some qadis who decided things on Shafi law because under Suleiman there are a number of fermans saying no longer Shafi law in Anatolia and the Balkans because Sipahis go make war, their wives get divorces at home using Shafi law. It's not gonna, because according to Shafi and Hanbali law, a woman can get a divorce after a few years of a disappearance of a husband, whereas in Hanafi law, the duration is much longer. Yes, 99 years, right, yeah. So a Ferman says no more Shafi law in the central lands. However, when we go to Egypt and Syria, all four legal schools continue to be in work, and women actually continue making use of this difference. I think it's in Judith Tucker's work that she shows examples. And from this regional thing, I wanted to ask Cengiz, shouldn't we also pay a little attention into the regional differences in Muslim, non-Muslim relations? I will refer, I think, to the same work that Professor Hanna referred, the new PhD dissertation becoming a book. There, Phoebe, I think? Yes, she makes a suggestion about sort of the higher tension at times between Greeks and Muslims in Balkans versus a lower level tension in Egypt as a result of a longer sort of coexistence, a longer history behind, which is the same with the four legal schools. There's a very long tradition of four legal schools in Egypt, so the Ottomans don't feel strong enough to change that. So could there be some room for these regional
It's
things?
more than room. I mean, it is like a huge hole is there for us to explore.
And in terms of legal things, recently I've been doing some reading, and somebody suggested to look at a work published in Turkish recently, Kenan somebody.
Kenan Macitoğlu?
Yes,
Yeah,
Kenan
yeah.
Macitoğlu.
Ottoman millet system, yes.
He claims the legal autonomy was much less in practice than it is usually claimed to be. It was just a matter of divorce and almost nothing else. Is that how it looks to you? And then the other question I had for Hussein was the vernacularization, going back to it. You said Safavids, Mughals, Ottomans, it is not given. But then isn't there a role, like the population that they're ruling? And doesn't that sort of have a significant role? And in that sense, I was thinking Turkish becoming significant in the long term plays a role in collective identity building in terms of the Turkish population of Anatolia and the Sultans. Doesn't happen right away, but could there be something about that in there?
Yeah, I start with that. As for the room and hall thing, yes, I mean it's a huge place to for us to explore there. Absolutely, there are regional differences, and also if you like follow the line, it's not a linear line, and in times we see that the Greeks and Armenians are replacing the Jews, and in other centuries we are seeing the Jews are replacing the others at the expense of the other side, and that creates, of course, a certain amount of tensions throughout the centuries. Up until the 19th century, we always see the tensions, and it was going up and down. In terms of Kenan Macitoğlu's argument, where he is arguing that there was this, he says that Ottomans managed the system through an it's called like a ruhani iltizam, like spiritual tax farming thing. I think he definitely made a good point, but I think he is completely missing the internal dynamics of the communities. He is looking at the things from the Ottoman perspective only and saying that there's no autonomy, not less autonomy. He said no autonomy because everyone, like all the community leaders were being kind of elected by the Ottomans. But I said it, they are not being elected; they are being approved. That's a big difference. I mean, they elect their leaders, communal or religious, but Ottomans approve it. Okay, so that gives them a considerable amount of autonomy there, and that I think also made the system flexible, and also I think that made the system quite almost successful to some extent, which created a mechanism by which many people coming from the different walks of life and from different confessions felt a need to develop a loyalty. Okay, I mean that is tying to the issue of like multiple identities on the Ottoman Empire. They created an imperial ethos about which we don't have much. We don't have much, the understanding of it. But they created an interesting ethos to which again we have seen that people did develop a loyalty on different levels, including non-Muslims. That was it, right? Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
That's a very good question, Bak. I would say there is some demographic base, undeniably. How we see that, for example, in the Mughal case, there is no significant Turkish-speaking community in India. So it's very understandable that they stuck with Persian and simply maintained that administrative and literary language for its prestige and convenience. Same could be said for Mamluks. In the case of Mamluks, we have actually quite a few translations into Kipchak Turkish for the use of rulers and princes exclusively, but not for the broader public. But if you compare the Ottomans to Safavids, and even more so to the Seljuks, they rely on comparable demographic basis, especially the Seljuks, who ruled almost 200 years and never produced anything in Turkish. But the Ottomans did, and particular reasons why Turkish became a literary, cultural, and administrative language in the Ottoman case, as I talk some of them, one is really the very Islamization. The folks at the frontier were very little Islamized. They were not Sunni at the time, as we know. They were not Hanafites. But in the 16th century, we know they were largely Hanafi, Maturidi, Sunni, etc. So the ulama wrote simplistic texts to propagate their version of Islam. And even the Sufis at the frontier, actually most Islamic texts were written by Sufis because they wanted to disseminate their understanding of Islam, especially in the form of hagiographies. Most hagiographies, almost all of them, were written in Turkish, and they became popular reads. So this pious obligation felt by the learned at the frontier to use Turkish. And secondly, it was education. Texts were either Persian or Arabic, but they were taught in Turkish, and more importantly, perhaps in later times, after, especially with the fall of Constantinople and the rise of institutionalization, the Ottoman elite, of whom a significant part came from non-Turkic background, the devshirme, and Turkish became their only language. Because let's think that the Ottomans maintained Persian as court language. Then these devshirmes had to be taught at least 2 languages. One Persian for administrative use and Turkish for daily communication. So as a result of those tangible and social reasons, Turkish increasingly became the preferred language, both in education and administration.
We've got 5 questions outstanding. Yes.
Maybe we have all the questions, and then mine is to Hayrettin. I liked the intervention and bringing political theory and political philosophy through Ibn Taymiyyah. Very interesting, because what we would have assumed that this classical theory of Islamic polity, the caliphate, imamate, become quite irrelevant after a certain period of time, especially with those empires, Cengiz Khan, Alexander the Great. I mean, there's a new reality on the ground, and we would have assumed that those theories became out of touch with reality. But now you argue that actually those theorists or theories would not have any grudges against these developments because they had the seeds of a theoretical perspective that will have accepted or accommodated or reflected on it. Can you at least elaborate on how this theory continued on the last 1,000 years?
This is an excellent, obviously, elaboration, Cengiz, and thank you for organizing this event, by the way. I didn't have a chance to mention it in the beginning. You know, the traditional view is that the Sunni Islamic political thought really declined after the 10th century because it was imitating the caliphate. And since the caliphate declined, you know, these people also, you know, quit actually looking at their realities, and, you know, they followed, you know, the reality basically. They legitimized every single ruler that is coming afterwards. And after the introduction of the Sultanates and the Mongols and the other dynasties, you know, they basically quit, you know, their work. And if you look at, for example, that was the traditional narrative. Later, Sunni political thought elaboration, they are frozen remains of the old good age. This is not the situation when you know, sit down and study actually those texts. And this is what I try to bring out, is that, you know, they have their own questions, you know, emanating from their own socio-political realities. And they want to engage the society, they want to engage politics, and they want to find answer to their own questions. So, you know, but at the same time, they are coming from a tradition, you know, an epistemological tradition that they cannot also basically simply dislodge. They have to negotiate this new reality with, you know, some of the fundamental principles that they actually like and would like to uphold. So, you know, the issue is that, you know, how we are going to do that. And this is exactly what Ibn Taymiyyah, I think, you know, where the tension lays, is exactly trying to really actually, well, you know, Al-Ghazali did it too, Al-Iji after Ibn Taymiyyah did it too. So it is not, you know, Ibn Taymiyyah is not single. This is a common story by all of them. So, you know, what I am, you know, trying to say here really is that in the general historiography of Islamic political thought, the most recent of which is obviously our dear colleague Patricia Crone, you know, it is a repetition of the traditional historiography, basically. If you read Hamilton Gibb, if you read Lampton, if you read Rosenthal, you are going to see the same arguments over there. So the paradigm has not been really changing that much in this field, and it became even more radical after 9/11. And so the issue is then basically, you know, trying to, well, the problem is not really about the observed, it is about the observer. You know, that, you know, we need to question ourselves and how we look at our material.
My question was also to Hayrettin Yucesoy. Picking up on your comments right now, it could well be argued that at the time Ibn Taymiyyah was somewhat of an outlier in terms of his representativeness of either, you know, wherever he stood from within multiple different intellectual discourses. So In other words, if someone wanted to undermine your intervention, they might point to the fact that, well, actually, the rest of all the major figures out there, and you name Al-Ghazali, well, that was well before Ibn Taymiyyah, and Al-Iji, well, that may begin to address the kind of questions that we have. So how would you actually go about filling in the void that you so clearly identify in terms of where, let's say, the coverage of classical golden age political thought stops? If you look at, you know, Patricia Corona's work of, let's say, the first 5 centuries, and then afterwards it stops. How would you even begin to fill in the gaps? What other kinds of figures you would look at? Then Ibn Taymiyyah, who arguably resonates well because he's a well-known figure today for rather different reasons, but he's not exactly what you would consider the representatives of the mainstream, either juridical or philosophical or mystical or any other kind of thought during the late 13th or early 14th century.
This is obviously, you know, thank you very much, Dr. Karam Mustafa. This is an extremely important and valid question, and it is definitely beyond my comfort zone. You know, anything beyond the 10th century is journalism for me. So, but, you know, having said that, there are actually some comparable figures that we can put side to side with Ibn Taymiyyah. One of them is Ibn Jama'ah, and you know, if we and there are a couple of other figures that, you know, whose name I don't remember at the top of my head. But, you know, if we change our angle, how we look at actually Islamic political thought, then, you know, we have no reason, for example, to exclude Mullah Sadra. We have no reason to exclude, for example, Tusi. We have no reason to exclude Davani. We have no reason to exclude Khnalizadeh from, you know, this paradigm. And, you know, this is our construct. And then, you know, we create a prophecy, and then we fulfill it. So that is the issue I think, you know, we need to address. There are comparable examples that we can go and study. And Ibn Taymiyyah, you can say, you know, all sorts of things about Ibn Taymiyyah, but you cannot say he was marginal, because we know that, you know, he was not during his time, and definitely, you know, after his time as well. You know, he was well read, and he was well communicated.
We've got 4 minutes.
That's from a political
We have 4 minutes? Yeah.
4 minutes, okay. First, thanks. This is a fantastic panel. Quickly, I was going to point out some of the same parallels with vernacularization in other places, but that's been done. I would only add that, you know, this is also the time period when vernacularization is happening in Europe. You know, I mean, Dante and so on up to Galileo. I mean, there's a fraughtness about vernacularization in Europe as well. So if we're going to, I mean, we shouldn't just see this as a question of the Islamic world. I mean, it might well be that, you know, the Abbasid fragmentation initiates a kind of vernacular moment, but something is happening sort of globally about vernacularization in India as well. I just also quickly want to respond to something Professor Dale said, since you brought it up, the question of Sabki Hindi. I'll try not to give a speech because we only have, now I'll try to keep it to a minute, but you know, the problem with the notion of Sabki Hindi as an Indian style of Persian poetry is that it replaces historiography or history, a sense of historicity about poetry, with a meta-geography. So in the 16th and 17th century, when poets are having a quarrel with the Persian, between the Persian, Indo-Persian ancients and moderns, that is just as sophisticated as what's going on in Paris, we call it Sabke Hindi as if it's, you know, the timeless essence of the, you know, abstruse Indian mind, which causes poets to write more difficult poetry. And what gets lost is the fact that they themselves referred to it, you know, as contemporary poetry, taza poetry, the poetry of this new age. And so, you know, it's a kind of modernizing impulse that's going on. And, you know, anyway, the 20th century scholarship just sort of, you lose all that. So, I mean, that is mainly my argument about that. Anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Actually, my question is to Hussein.
Hussein here.
No, yourself.
Hayrettin.
Well, so I'm sorry. Hayrettin, of course, and Khair as well. With respect to Ibn Taymiyyah, in North Africa, Ibn Taymiyyah is marginalized, attacked, not popular whatsoever. Why is that?
What period of time?
From the time, I mean, you said that he was well connected and well read, but I would say, I will argue that he was read and well connected to the eastern part of rather than the North African part, which he was actually attacked. And I just look at it, and there are 2 points that come to my mind. One is the Sufi tradition of the North Africans, and then the second one is their rushing to save the Jews from the Inquisition, and hence their broad-mindedness of the North African tradition. Any comments?
Well, I have to admit my ignorance here about North Africa, but we know, I mean, obviously Ibn Taymiyyah was in Egypt, and, he was also in the greater Syria area, and, there is another problem over here. I really don't know about the particularities of the case in here, but what I am feeling, allow me to make that assumption, there is some modern nation state and nationalist assumption as well about how Islamic history actually should be read. And this is another problem that we need to tackle, that all of these nation states in the region have been creating their own national narratives, and some of the great figures of Islamic history as well either rejected or appropriated and reappropriated for their own purposes. So there may be some kind of that type of nation state regional prejudices as well, but I'll have to check into that. Thank you.
Okay, very last question. Yeah.
Yeah, my question pertains to the role of the Quran in the three empires. We now have a proliferation.
Yeah, for everybody.
We have about 90 translations of the Quran. When was the Quran translated into Turkish or Mughal or the Safavid? Or did it stay within the elite, kept in Arabic, and hence the public didn't have direct access to the meaning of the Quran like we have now, and hence the enormity of perhaps public interpretations of the Quran as against the interpretations through the ulama before? How?
That's a huge question.
And
one person wants to have one sentence. That's not your field. That's fair enough, right? Yeah, Stephen, very quickly.
The only region I know about the translation of the Quran is when I first did my research on the Muslims in Kerala, Padmi Said, largely ulama, and the man who translated the Quran into Malayalam, the local Dravidian language in Kerala, was essentially outcasted from the society for many years for doing it. It is now widely used, this translation, but in the Mughal case, I'm sorry, in the Mughal case, I don't know. But in the case of Kerala, it's a very clear-cut example, and it wasn't done until this is an area where you have very sophisticated Hadhrami Sayyid scholars from a very early period of time. They're Jifri, Alawi from the Hadramaut. So the Arabic tradition is very strong, and so it isn't until the 1970s that it's translated into Malayalam.